Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. It started with Ilhan Omar constantly talking about how she could help out the Somali community, and ultimately, really, she saw Somalia as her homeland. But she's spawned a whole new wave of American politicians who now seem more than okay with referring to foreign countries as the ones they actually see as their homes. You have guys like Zohran Mamdani in New York. He's only been here, he's only one generation born in the United States, and yet he feels like he is ready to rearrange everything, introduce socialism, and fix all the problems of the country he just ended up in. Joining me today to talk about this phenomenon is an author, he's a host, Jack Posobiec. Thank you so much for coming on, man.
What's going on, Auron? Huge fan. Listen to the show all the time. I just saw the chat that I popped in. It says Poso needs to bring up Pizza Hut nationalism. If he doesn't, he'll be very disappointed. And it's actually a really good way to get into the conversation because Pizza Hut nationalism is a huge part of this, by the way, because we are going to talk about how diluting the national character leads to an erosion of civic society.
Yeah, we're definitely going to get into what we might think of as different definitions for nationalism or what makes someone American. And this is actually where you kind of got in a little bit of trouble, I guess we could call this, or just the media decided
Oh,
a bunch
oh,
of
I, I,
twirls.
I waded
Right.
right into this one. I was talking to some friends backstage at this Turning Point event last week down in Tampa, and let's just say it was my coterie of Twitter anons that I have going up, and I said, yeah, should we mention Epstein? I said, definitely going to mention Epstein. You have to get into that, but I want to get into this broader question and push the envelope a little bit more on these guys walking around claiming that they can run for office when they're clearly just not American. And it's on the face of it not American, so it goes viral. People are attacking me all over it, and because I said these guys aren't American. They're not. I know there's a piece of paper that they may have in many instances that says they're American, but they're not. They're not an American. And then I get the email from Unheard and some reporter over there who says, this litany of questions and regarding my statement. I just hit him back with the classic Sam Hyde of everyone knows what an American is. Everyone
And
knows.
that's so critical because this is what people want to go into, right? I need all the nuance. I need every little bit.
Yep.
Lay it down, the letter of the law, and that's why Sam Hyde's response was so great, and that's why yours, mirroring that, is also great. Like, guys, we know what we're talking about. Everyone knows what an American is until you decide to break this all down and try to get pedantic about it. But obviously, it can't just be filling out forms or a piece of paperwork. Every other nation around the world more or less understands that it is a people, right? It's a legal framework, it's a state, there's a government in charge of it, but there's also a culture, there's a tradition, there's a language, there's a heritage and a history. These things reach back, and most nations in some way or another allow people to kind of come in and weave into that fabric. Some are more open, some are less, but there's usually some process by which that can occur. But no one in Japan thinks that if you or I moved there in 3 years, we would just be Japanese. And by the
Well,
way, we
well,
could tell every Japanese person how to run Japan.
well. The fact that you mentioned it is so funny. So I lived in China for 2 years. I speak Mandarin Chinese. Learn the language. I can read it. I can type it. I wouldn't say I can write it, but I can type it. And I lived there for quite some time and have no problem being able to converse with. I could have this conversation in Mandarin right now, but no one at any point of me going around in China would ever consider me Chinese. And in fact, there's a term that they use predominantly for whites of European descent. They'll say Lao Wai. And I always used to bring this up and I would say, like, well, actually, Lao Wai doesn't just mean foreigner, it means white. And I would say, what do you mean? I said, well, because they never use that for if someone were black, if someone were of any other ethnicity, you would only use it for white people. So it clearly means white. So even then, in that instance, the average Chinese person just on the street would see me and would just go, Lao Wai. And they're very clearly using that nationalist kind of reference to identify me as a foreigner and an outsider. And guess what? That's the norm. That's the normal way that countries operate. That's the way that peoples operate. That's the way that history just is. And it doesn't matter. And this, which I'd love to get into at some point, is since post 1965, and really this sort of like the great counterculture movement or whatever you want to call it. This idea has somehow been like showered over our eyes that we're supposed to believe that people just can be whatever they want to be and label themselves whatever they want, even though reality is still reality.
Well, I think a lot of this comes from the story of the Americas as a place where immigrants come to, right? This is ultimately the
Yeah.
idea that everyone had to travel over here. Most of the European populace obviously is not native, those kind of things. And so this gives the idea that America is just these waves of different levels of immigration. But I've had it put to me this way, and I think this is exactly right. America isn't a nation of immigrants, it's a nation of settlers. I mean, if we're being honest, it's a
Yes.
nation of conquerors, right? It's a nation of people who cut a country out of the wilderness, and that's much different than people who show up hundreds of years after the country has been built to apply for social security and Medicaid, right?
Well, of course, and even the people who were here prior to that, my co-author and I, Joshua Lysek, sometimes jokingly refer to what we call American Indians as Siberian Americans. If we're going to go with the hyphenation, well, yeah, those are Siberian Americans because they're originally from Siberia. So actually, everyone is from somewhere. That's just how the world works. That's how history works. How far back do you want to go? But the point being is an American, and I would even go so far as to say that the word American should only apply to someone who came post the founding of the nation of America, because number one, that name in and of itself is a European name, right? It was an Italian, a map maker, a cartographer, and the nation of America with the cities and the civic society and everything that we know of it as today did not exist prior to those early English colonies in the 1600s.
Now, the other way that this is often approached, and I hear this one on the right, there's a number of people, I think you've referred to them as the woke light, who are very concerned about the definition of American. And for them, the only proper definition is the propositional American, right? You have to assent to these propositions, and that's what makes us Americans. We're bound together by these ideas and this code. And don't get me wrong, as Americans, we have principles. We do have a idea that permeates who we are and how we want to conduct ourselves. But ultimately, that idea comes from our history and our tradition, right? We have the English
Hmm.
law tradition, the common law tradition, obviously all the cultural connections that come from that Anglo past, and Protestant Christianity. These are the things that I think early on really define the United States. Now, obviously, we have added to that in time, and that's true of all nations. But the idea that anyone who walks in and says, yes, I believe in these things is an American, that doesn't seem to work because, as we're seeing from people like Mamdani or Omar or this guy, is it Fateh? I'm not sure how to say it, out of Minneapolis. All of these people, entered the country legally at some point, but ultimately have rejected the creed of the United States. They've rejected the proposition of the United States. But no one is deporting these people just for that. And I don't see these guys on the right who go with the propositional nation calling for the deportation of all these people who have rejected the American creed. So how can you have a purely propositional nation when part of the proposition of the United States is, well, you get to speak your mind. You get to have free speech. You can't have both where someone has to be an ideological adherent and also they can speak out against the ruling ideology if they wish, right?
Right, and this is where all of these things, kind of go into play with each other. Which, by the way, the woke lights, they want you to believe that America's founding fathers were some kind of wishy-washy, classic liberal universalists. When you can just go look at some of the early laws they passed or the way that they conducted themselves state by state, it's just clearly not true. It's not even a little bit true. And the idea then that they thought America would be this melting pot was ridiculous. Even Benjamin Franklin, I'm from Pennsylvania originally, and even Benjamin Franklin was saying back then, he said, we have too many Germans in Pennsylvania. We need to shut that down a little bit. I don't know if he was referring specifically to the Amish or the Mennonite communities that were coming into central Pennsylvania. But even then, he would refer to the Germans as swarthy, central
Right. Right.
Central Europeans. And so, this idea that they didn't have these beliefs it's preposterous. It's ahistorical. It doesn't actually reflect our history. It in fact reflects a fake history that they are attempting to foist upon the United States. And it's just not true. It's just not there. Now, when you talk about this, and people get like really scared when you start saying, "Oh, Anglo-Saxon Protestant heritage." I say, wait, okay, guys, give you example. I'll give you example. I'll say, like, do you know who Romeo and Juliet are? Do you know Romeo and Juliet? Okay, well, why do you know that? Why do you care about Romeo and Juliet? Romeo and Juliet was written 500 years ago by a British playwright. So 500 years ago by a playwright that's not from our country, why does Romeo and Juliet resonate with you? Because you are part of that culture, because of the cultural heritage that is extended upon you that continues in and you can call it unbroken, or you could call it in a complex tapestry of history and cultural history that extends from Britain of Shakespeare's time all the way till now. That's why you know who Romeo and Juliet are. When I was in China, they don't make references to Romeo and Juliet. Guess what they make references to? Chinese poets, Chinese history. They bring up Chinese, generals, which are also woven into Chinese history, and that's their point of reference because that's their shared point of reference. So when you're living in that country, when you're living in that area, even though I am not Anglo-Saxon, I'm not Protestant, but guess what? I'm in this country and I'm in this cultural tradition in the Anglo sphere because that's what the Anglosphere is, the English-speaking nations. It's more than just a language. It is a cultural identity that people have woven into over time. This is what makes you a people, and that's different from just being able to like go to Wikipedia and say, "Oh, I'm going to research all of the stuff that I'm supposed to know from being in this tradition and Photoshop it onto." No. It just doesn't work. And I think at this point, it's gotten to the breaking point because we have now these ethnic enclaves within the United States. And you mentioned a few of them just in your opening, talking about Ilhan Omar's district or Rashida Tlaib's district. New York City is certainly becoming a sort of version of this where you're seeing like the ethnic enclaves vote against, or at least these portions of them vote against other members of ethnic enclaves. And so, and the big difference here is that there is no assimilation because post 1965, and you can see Robert Putnam has done so much work on this, that the assimilation hasn't taken place because we're importing so many people from so many radically different cultures again and again and again. And I think it really just puts the lie to the test that not anyone can just become an American. It doesn't work.
Yeah, and that's really critical because, of course, the story of America is the story of a number of different populations adding to that Anglo-Protestant core, right? And I love to go to the work of Samuel Huntington because I think both
Yeah.
he's a very intelligent guy and he's also someone who was more of a center-left Harvard professor, right? This is not some bomb-throwing right-wing radical. But he made the same point that you're referencing with Putnam there, that ultimately these highly diverse communities, they tend to have lower social trust because they don't have any level of assimilation. And Huntington's point is if you ignore the core of what America is, which we have basically done since the Hart-Celler Act, and said, oh, well, anyone can be American from anywhere and it doesn't matter. When you do that, there's nothing for new immigrants to assimilate to. And so not everyone who comes to the United States is going to be, as you point out, Anglo or Protestant. But if you're coming to the United States, you are looking to adapt to that culture. You are looking to assimilate to that culture. When you understand that that is the majority culture, and when you maintain a demographic majority of that culture, then it becomes very clear that the few people who come in need to adapt and change. Maybe they don't go all the way. Maybe they don't magically become Anglo or Protestant, but they make cultural changes. They make lifestyle changes that bring them closer in line with this. They don't sit in, as you pointed out, ethnic enclaves that defend their language from another country, their history, their heritage from another country. They don't frequently go back to another country and refer to it as their homeland. These are basic changes that must be made, and not everybody can do it. It seems like, from what we can tell, those who were more likely to regularly interact with the Anglo tradition are the ones who are more able to adapt to the Anglo tradition, which means more Europeans have been able to adapt than others. That's not 100% the case. There are a few European groups that have been difficult to assimilate. There have been some, for instance, Asian groups that are slightly easier to assimilate. But the general rule seems to be that the more contact your civilization had with an Anglo civilization, the more compatible you are with possible assimilation when you arrive in the United States.
Yeah, and again, this is just history. So everything that we're saying right now isn't even we're not making normative arguments. We're just making descriptive arguments. This is just history. This is just the way things happened, the way things went down. And so when you look at things like the American founding, or things like the history of Thanksgiving. This is why, by the way, Thanksgiving itself has become such a national flashpoint in these culture wars, because there's this idea of an American history where Thanksgiving, was Thanksgiving a quote unquote settler holiday? And people say, why do you care so much about Thanksgiving, Posobiec? Why do you bring it up? Because no, it actually matters so much in terms of policy, in terms of our national vision, in terms of whether or not we're going to continue as this. So Thanksgiving, Christopher Columbus, all of these things that refer back to America's original founding and our actual history moving forward, then become under assault, because you'll see these groups who particularly tend to be immigrants who had nothing to do with either American Indians or any of these other groups that were around at the time, or like, why are they so against the South and the Confederates or something? They it's such an issue. People weren't even here back then in the 1860s. It had nothing to do with you, and you're not African American or related in any way. And it's because it's part of this 1619 version of America, where they can use to attack the social fabric and the cultural fabric of what they view as the current status quo in America, tear that down, and then replace it with a new revolutionary core. That's why they want to replace Christopher Columbus Day with, Indigenous Peoples Day. That's why they want to teach you and teach your kids that Thanksgiving was, it was not done by, these nice colonists. It was actually this horrible, tragic genocide of the Indians, and bring that up over and over and over. Why? Because they want to take power. It's really that simple, and that's where these ideas lead.
Let me ask you this, because I think a large part of this is also technology. We had large waves
So
of
true.
immigration previously. The Irish and Italians were often treated as not welcome because they had a foreign religion at that time. They were understood as a different culture. But over time, they were able to weave their way into the American fabric. But a big reason why was that there was no ability to instantly send money back to the homeland, visit the homeland again, make a phone call back to grandma in Italy. You couldn't, you couldn't send an email. You couldn't continue to listen to all the music and consume all the media from your home country. Yes, there were often ethnic enclaves. People did all move into Irish neighborhoods or Italian neighborhoods, but those neighborhoods were kind of cut off from the countries they came from, right? Now, anyone can immediately call back to Somalia, call back to Mexico, send money to their family. They can stay in touch constantly, and they can live inside their ethnic enclave. So really, we even have this phenomenon where a large number of people will get asylum from countries like Haiti or Somalia, and then will go back on vacation, which is just absolute madness. So I think there has been a big shift in the ability of these ethnic enclaves to sustain themselves, not just internally, but they can continue to network and create this greater Somalia or greater
Mhm.
Mexico or all these other country effect, where they can project their influence into the countries they're in rather than assimilating to the ones they've moved to.
Yeah, you can actually hear Omar Fateh mention this in one of those clips that someone pulls up from him, where he's talking about how his enclave of Somalia is an extension of greater Somalia, so his diaspora. And what we've really done, and technology does enable this, is create, turn America from a nation and devolved it into a nation of mini nations. So there are now mini nations within the United States, within the greater nation, and people can all sense this. People can certainly sense this, and you see this reflected in, and I keep bringing this up, the breakdown of civic society since the 1960s. Go read Bowling Alone from Putnam, that really walks into this, and just the complete lack of participation, to how people want to hunker down. This, by the way, has a massive depressive effect on birth rates, because people are less certain, people feel less secure. And when you're surrounded by these mini nations and you're not a member of them, right, you want to find your nation, you want to find your people. And the sort of like fake sitcom Hollywood, Netflix America, where it's like, oh, everyone's super diverse and there's all these offices where everyone's like really cool and working together, like it just doesn't work. It doesn't even work in reality. That in reality, people do kind of seek like. It's just normal, it's just natural. And so when people do this through technology, not only are they able to continue in these diasporas, but even you're seeing it with Omar Fateh, who he was born in the United States, and yes, on paper, so he's born in the US, and he's lived in the U.S. his whole life. He may have traveled back and forth to Somalia, I don't know, but he refers to it as our home, because in his world, within that community, that is the homeland. They do have a direct tie to it, and you're talking beyond just text messages. I mean, I remember when I was talking about when I lived in China. Back then I had to use the calling cards to be able to get back home, and you had to check, when was the right time, and someone's by the phone. Now you could be on FaceTime all day long, just having a video call with someone in Somalia. I know they are, because I see my Uber drivers doing it all the time in Washington, D.C., and having these just, 8-hour conversations that just go nowhere. And so there's these massive extensions of that sort of that communal living that extend to the United States mentally, as well as as well as physically back home. And so, and the more you import, the more you're just importing and growing that mini nation, which never actually, breaks. And so the bubble never melts into the rest of the United States. You're just extending the size of the mini nation. Now, people used to refer to, you would hear this on the right, they would talk about like no-go zones and Sharia zones and things like that. But I don't even think it's as hyperbolic as that. I think just what it really is you're importing a group of people who have their own nation and will continue to have their own nation for all the reasons that we've outlined here. And they view their allegiance towards that than they do certainly to anything here in the United States.
Yeah, and I do have people saying they're having a hard time hearing you. So if you have the opportunity to turn up your gain a little bit, that'd be awesome.
Oh,
there you
let
go.
me see anything I can do.
But as you were saying there, I think this is why so many people are now addressing legal immigration as well as illegal immigration, because for a very long time, the talking points from the GOP were, okay, yes, we support borders, those kind of things, but ultimately we're only against the illegal version of immigration. Now, more and more people are recognizing that, yes, we of course have to close the border and we need to deport those who are here illegally, but we also need to look at the problem of legal immigration, because when you have a guy like Mamdani coming to the United States, well, he's born here. He's a first generation. His parents immigrated. He's the first born naturally on U.S. soil, but he immediately wants to change everything about the United States. This is not a guy who is interested in any way folding his country into the U.S. He wants to be able to operate the United States as this like Tower of Babel economic zone. He doesn't have any interest in the history, has any interest in the culture. He isn't interested in perpetuating the traditions or holding the values in the United States. His entire purpose here is to, deconstruct America as we understand it. And a lot of people have focused on the fact that he's a Muslim, and of course, I strongly believe that we should not have Islamic politicians. I don't think that is something that we should have in the United States. It's a foreign religion completely incompatible with the U.S. But it's not just his Islamic status. He is willing to work with pretty much anyone in New York who is interested in dismantling the United States as we know it. He's a Muslim who's pushing trans ideology and these kind of things. And so it really becomes clear that ultimately, even these legal immigrants often are only interested in what they can do to dismantle the U.S. or what they can do to glean advantages for their people as they see it out of the U.S., not in any way being a part of the American experience.
Hey, let me just ask, did that help my mic at all there?
Still a little quiet. I don't know if you're able to turn that up at
It's
all.
got to be something with the yeah, I don't know. This is my
That's okay.
my
We'll
normal
suffer.
rant for
You're
the
you're
show.
still I can still hear you. Just some people are saying our volume was really mismatched. So, but
Yeah,
no
yeah, no, it's my
no
normal.
problem. Yeah, now you're cut off. Now you're muted. Yeah, now I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, and you're louder. So that's good.
All right, cool. Yeah, I'll try to speak up a little bit too. It could just be a software thing. Yeah, no. And so this is something that I want to get into in the sense that when people are looking at these things, right? People, you have a tendency, a lot of people have a tendency to get very uh, statistical and abstract with it. I'll just tell you as a story. So I lived through this in my lifetime. My town in Norristown, Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia, was one of these towns where I grew up and I had a very small taste of what I'm talking about. That's why this issue is so important to me and so close to my home, like literally, that I lived in the house that my father grew up in, which was a house purchased by his father in a town where my family had lived for 100 years. My house was 80 years old by the time that I was born. And by the way, this was it was like a row home in Norristown. It was meant for workers, but it was very nice. It was so much nicer than the house that, even the homes you get now, the woodworking, stained glass windows, but that was standard at turn of the century. And so the difference, though, is that starting in the late 90s, Section 8 started really coming in, and Housing and Urban Development came in and started putting up all these homes and all these blocks for that type of housing. And so crime really started flooding in our country, or in our town. And then all of a sudden, in 2002, our town, we didn't have a name for it back then, but it became a sanctuary city. So that's the easiest way to put it. They started accepting Mexican consular, identification for people to rent a home or buy a home and access public services. And so it became one of the areas that was totally flooded by Mexican illegal immigration. And in a weird way, where like the Mexican consulate was well aware of what was going on and totally supported it. And the town council thought it was great too, because they said, hey, this is going to be more people that are coming into our town. Well, my family got out because crime absolutely skyrocketed. And this was a town, the kids who I grew up with were the kids that my parents had grown up with, that my father had been friends with, and they still lived in the same homes as their parents because that's just how it was, Irish, Italian, Polish living in this area, and completely flooded by crime, completely flooded by people who had no interest in making the town any better, but just looking at it as an economic, an economic suction zone where they could just extract whatever resources they could from the town and then move on. And that's how it is now. You go and look at the town is absolutely filled with crime. It's absolutely filled with illegals. Actually, funny enough, just a couple of days ago, got some videos because there was some liberal activist group was trying to help out, and there was an ICE raid in the town. So the ICE raid, finally, 20 years in the making that I've been waiting for this. We've seen ICE raids going on in my hometown because I talk about this all the time, and people are like, okay, Posobiec's probably just trying to no, it's really bad. It's actually really bad. And so I've lived with this. I've seen how it destroys communities. I wish that my kids now could live in a community like the one that I had. They are few and far between. And no, I don't want to have to go move halfway around the country to be able to find something like this. We should be able to have those in the ones where my family lived. I was baptized in the same church that my father was and the same church that his father was. And then my kids couldn't be baptized there because of all of these forces working together. That's what I'm talking about. That's what this is about.
It's really amazing because we look at people like Elon Musk who worry about people having children. Why aren't we having enough children? There isn't enough replacement birth rate. And then you look at exactly the problems you're pointing out, that we are actively transforming
Yep.
neighborhoods. All of the research, like you said, with Putnam, shows that when you increase diversity in the neighborhood, people are less likely to trust each other. They're less likely to go out and spend time talking to each other. And very importantly, they're less likely to have children because they're unsure about the future. They don't know what's going on. We have a lot of people looking at the Mamdanis of the world and saying, well, how could people be so stupid? He's an open communist. He's an open Marxist. We know Marxism loses. And so how can you rationally look at this? But this is the wrong way to understand it. It's not about rationality. Guys like Mamdani, they're not here to like prove an economic theory. They're here to loot you, right? Like they don't care.
Yes.
Like the Marxism, the Islam, the colonialist narrative, it's just that. It's a narrative to justify why it's okay to redistribute your money, why it's okay to break apart your neighborhood. That's the actual answer. It's ethnic resentment. It's the ability to withdraw value from a neighborhood that you don't value because you didn't build it. And then, like you said, they can just move on. But for those of us who have generations of family in the same area or in this country, ultimately we're the ones losing out. But most American politicians, they don't care, because as long as the GDP goes up inside their district, they can run around saying, look, I did something amazing. They don't have to notice that no one in their district is able to buy a home or have children anymore.
Yeah, you get these GDP firsters who, just don't quite actually look at the root causes of any of this. And so that's where, I can appreciate where Elon's coming from when he says we need to get our birth rates up. And, it's just that he doesn't seem to be looking at the broader picture of why the average person isn't having more kids. And it is, broadly speaking, economic. And I talk about this in Unhumans. We talk about it on Human Events Daily, that it, and to add perhaps something to Andrew Breitbart's, famous adage about politics being downstream of culture, I would simply point out that culture is downstream of economics. And what I mean by that is people say, oh, well, so your money is most important. No. What I'm saying is when you have a culture that is allowed to be able to breathe freely, that is allowed to be able to survive, that is allowed to be able to flourish, then that will posit good culture beyond that, when a people are able to have that good commerce, that natural commerce. But when you have these massive artificial waves coming in of people that don't share our values, that people have no heritage whatsoever in common with the people who live here now, and are brought in through this massive series of government programs and NGOs and this huge archipelago of secret systems to be able to bring them in, then obviously you are going to dilute all of these things, and it's being done in the name of economics. So you have to get the economics right for the people before you can have a better culture, before you can have a healthy culture, or before you can have healthy politics. We simply don't have those, and we're looking downstream of an upstream problem.
Yeah, the people have to be served by the economics. The economics can't serve the people, right? Like and that's really critical. And in understanding that ultimately these values, these abstract understandings of who we are, they come from something concrete. They come from the people themselves. This idea of limited government, this idea of self-government, these ideas that are often tied to the founding, ordered liberty, these things came from a particular culture, a particular tradition, particular way of life. Stephen Miller was just on with some talking head, I forget which one, and he said something that shocked them, but should be fairly obvious. He said, look, the problem with Haiti is that there are Haitians who live there and run it the way that they run it. The problem with Somalia is that Somalians run Somalia the way that they do. You can't just take all the people who make up those countries that are not doing well, drop them in a concentrated ball in some Midwestern city in the United States, and expect that place to not be much like the places they left. Yes, 1, 2, maybe 3 of these people from a country that can assimilate and be part of a community, maybe over time, many generations, they might move towards more the American way of life. But there is zero chance that you just move Somalia or Haiti to the United States and that fixes the problem, because the problem is tied to the way of being of the people who were in that country in the first place.
Yeah, and we spent trillions of dollars trying to do this during the war on terror and the failed nation building project, thinking that we could export the US Constitution and the US system to places like Iraq and Afghanistan that are totally unprepared for it and totally uninterested in it. You're not going to have Jeffersonian democracy just spring forth in the Middle East, which has no background in it whatsoever. This is a tribal culture. This is a culture that is very clannish. There's the cousin marriages, and Steve Saylor's talked about this, how it just doesn't work, and there's so much interconnectivity there. And so the idea that you can import a group of people from one of those areas here and change it. Look, here's what I said in my speech. If you took the entire population of the United States and swapped it, right? You think of the mental experiment, swapped it with the people of Afghanistan. So all the Americans are now living in Afghanistan. All the Afghanis are now living here. Guess what? You're not going to magically just change the system. No, we'd make Afghanistan look more like America, and they
Right.
would make America look more like Afghanistan. That's exactly what would happen because the system is not the words on the piece of paper. The American system is the American people.
Absolutely. And before we let time get away from us, because I want to make sure we hit this, it's so important. Dovetailing onto all of this, obviously, President Trump finally gets the ICE funding he's been fighting for. We know that border crossings are already way down. I think that's the greatest accomplishment of the Trump administration so far, taking them so low compared to what especially Biden was doing. It's just insane. But everybody is waiting for the deportations, right? They've started, we're getting the worst people out, but people know ultimately we're going to need larger scale deportations. So they back this ICE funding. And the minute it passes, 10 Republicans turn around and immediately stab every GOP voter in the back. We have Maria Salazar of Florida here, and she is already pushing this dignity program, which is just rebranded amnesty. And it's so clearly rebranded amnesty. The bill is so sloppy, it doesn't even let you look at local and federal databases to see if one of the people applying for this program is a gang member. Like that's how ridiculous this bill is. But we're already seeing this. Why is the GOP, or why are portions of the GOP so dead set on betraying the MAGA voters right after they finally get the enforcement budget that is necessary to execute the plan that Donald Trump promised?
Look, this is something that MAGA voters have to be so strong on, by the way. Then they're going to play on your sensibilities. They're going to play on your Christian sensibilities. They're going to say, oh, well, they just want to work here. They just want to be helpful. First of all, Molly Tibbetts, by the way, was murdered by a farm worker in Iowa about 1 hour away from where the Iowa Fairgrounds is. So, no, these people are not supposed to be here in the first place, number one. Number two, they're creating these mini nations within our nation. And number three, they're here for economic extraction. They are not here to make America better. But also, the reason that the GOP and many factors of the GOP are for this is because you have so much of the Chamber of Commerce and these groups that want the cheap labor here, that obviously know about the illegal labor, that obviously know what's going on because they're all in on it, and they want to continue that gravy train coming in. The Democrats, of course, want it for the votes. And also, by the way, the dilution of the national census for their congressional districts. And so you can talk about the morality of this all day long, but when it really comes down to it, the way to fight back is you have to push against any of these ideas of a soft amnesty or a dignity, man. That is so like Orwellian, right? It's a dignity. What about the dignity of the American people? What about justice for people? And as I said this to somebody on Twitter the other day when they said, well, I'm a practicing Catholic and how can I support deportations? I say, okay, no, I understand that. But, what about the justice for people who had to flee their homes in the face of this mass of people completely overtaking your town and collapsing all of those systems? Where's justice for that? Where's justice for the millions upon millions of Americans who had to uproot and leave cities, towns, and villages or where they were living in the face of all this, or people who lost jobs because of this? By the way, economically speaking, this is also one of the huge issues with automation, because when you have this massive cheap labor force, it disincentivizes automation. So guess what? You're not even going to need a low level labor force. This is one of those ridiculous arguments that they make over and over again. You're not even going to need this if you push for automation. But why would they want to do? Why would these businesses want to put in the capital costs for buying one of these, auto pickers or whatever it is for cotton, tomatoes, apples, mention it, because they have this cheap labor force. So again, it's something you're not going to need. And then, oh, by the way, when automation does hit, what are we going to do with this huge population that you've brought in? And that's what leads to these revolutionary looter forces that you're talking about, and a Zohran Mamdani, because you're creating the economic pressures and tensions that lead to a Marxist revolution.
That's exactly correct. This is so obvious that it's insane that this is not just a core argument that is brought up over and over again. Eventually, these jobs will get automated out of existence. That's the goal of everyone right now who's working in these fields anyway. So we're bringing in millions and millions of usually military-aged men, single. They came here because they just saw the economic zone. They don't care about the United States. They're completely detached from the culture. They're entirely invested in, some kind of ethnic enclave and have no interest in the wider United States. And then while they're sitting around in the US, you're going to tell me that you're going to cut off basically all of their opportunities to be employed. You're going to replace everything that they came here for. What is going to happen? Obviously, like you said, you're going to end up with an insurgent force. That's exactly what happens. Maybe if you're lucky, just politically, a bunch of guys, engaging in some kind of Marxist activism, but more likely it will spread to violent politics. We've already seen assaults on ICE agents. We've already seen the attempted killing of ICE agents. It's only going to get worse. These people are only going to get more violent as they recognize this as an existential threat to the type of life that they wanted to cultivate inside the United States. Imagine piling on the fact that they can't even get the jobs. They can't even hold the jobs that they thought that they were going to hold. They're not going to make any of the money. They're not going to be having any of the success. Their desperation will skyrocket, and you will naturally see waves and waves of possible immigrant terrorism inside the United States. I don't think it's a stretch at all to expect exactly that outcome.
By the way, when the LA anti-ICE riots were taking place, if people remember, one of the ubiquitous images that we saw throughout all of that was the burning of Waymos. And I remember, so Waymos are these driverless taxis. They have them in Phoenix. They've introduced them in LA, San Francisco. I hear that we're getting them here in DC pretty soon. I hate them so much. I refuse to ride in one. But I saw they were burning the Waymos, and I said, oh, look, they're going after the competition.
Well, Jack, let me ask you this as we're wrapping up here. And I know you're busy. I don't know if you have time to take some questions from the audience or not. But
I can do some. Yeah, let's do some.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, before we go to the questions of the people, then let me ask you this final question. Here is my basic premise. This should be the counter argument, the counter offer to those pushing the amnesty deal, right? Ultimately, I think in the United States, we need at minimum a 15-year, maybe longer, but at minimum a 15-year legal immigration moratorium. Some carve outs for people getting married, those kind of things. If you find Einstein somewhere, okay, you can bring him in. But in general, we need a moratorium on the vast amount of immigration we have coming into the United States. And when we finally do coalesce back as a nation, find our community, find our identity, at that point, we need an immigration system that is multi-generational. You might, if you prove to be culturally compatible and you are allowed the honor of entering the United States as a temporary visitor or worker, these kind of things, you have to be here multiple generations before your descendants can begin involving themselves in the voting process. No more, hey, I come here, I have a kid here, and that kid immediately can start voting stuff for my community apart from the United States. We need a multi-generational way to weave people into the fabric of the U.S., and only after we've had the kind of moratorium that will allow us to reestablish our national identity.
No, I think that all sounds like stuff I agree with. I mean, this idea that anyone can, by the way, I even know for a fact that there are people now, when you go to take the test, even if you don't speak English, they teach you like the actual questions and then what your responses should be,
Yes.
but it's like a rote memorization kind of thing. So rather than learning the language, because you're supposed to, you have to do the test in
That's one of the
English because you're supposed to
requirements.
learn
Yep.
English. But what they'll do is they'll go through these courses where they do the rote memorization. Then you can get in. Now, boom, oh, I've taken the test, but you didn't even learn English in the first place. And you're not doing the work whatsoever. So the whole system is broken. The whole system needs an absolute revamp. And we need to get back to, I'd love to get back to the pre 1965 immigration system whereby you do have area caps where we look at, okay, what do we actually need as a country, right? So what do we need? What do the American people need? What does our country need? Are there economic interests that can be served by immigration that help us and not just, corporate powers, and then figure it out from there, going back to that situation. You remember Ted Kennedy, he even had quotes that, oh, this is not going to change the ethnic makeup of the United States. It's just a complete lie. It's just a
Right.
complete and utter lie.
And it is okay, as you're alluding to pre-Hart Celler, it is okay to have a policy of preferring people into your country who will be compatible with your country. There is nothing wrong with that. There's nothing shameful about that. It is okay to prefer people, as you say, who are going to benefit your country and will be compatible, will be able to adopt the language, will be able to adopt the lifestyle, will fit into the United States. And that's not going to be everyone. And it's okay to say that. It's okay to say that we are explicitly choosing people because they benefit this country, not because this country might benefit their checkbook at some point. I think that's a very clear thing that we need to be doing. Well, before we go to the questions of the people, Jack, I think most people probably know what you're doing, but I know you got the book out there, the show. Can you let people know where to find your great work?
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. We've got the book is Unhumans, The Secret History of Communist Revolutions and How to Crush Them, Jack Posobiec, Joshua Lysek. And it's been out for a year, and man, it is still just selling like crazy. It made New York Times bestseller, and it's just one of those books where this isn't a philosophical work where we're going to debate communism. And we get into really more of what you're talking about here, where the communists don't actually believe in communism. It's all just window dressing. It is a scam. Communism is a tactic of people who are resentful and angry and want to destroy whatever system they infect next out of this petty resentment, envy, jealousy, and rage. This is why they do the things that they do. And so we walk through a series of case studies of, throughout history, and then we come up with ways to disrupt and destroy them, mostly through mocking, identifying, calling out what they're doing. It's a lot of fun, and boy, they really hate us. My favorite review of it, by the way, was we went so hard in the paint on this thing that the Communist Party of the USA actually wrote a huge takedown of the book trying to attack it. And I said, boy, you've done something right when the actual communists have to respond to you. So we're out there on that. The podcast is Human Events Daily. And by the way, the speech that I gave at Turning Point last week that kind of generated this discussion, we're going to be posting that we haven't even posted it because this week's been so busy. It's been a binder of a week. What can I say? And so we're going to be posting that speech in full this weekend. Human Events Daily, wherever you get your podcast, Apple, Spotify, etc. We're up there.
Yeah, getting denounced by the Communist Party is kind of like getting denounced by the Church of Satan. It's like, well, I
It
guess
was
you got me, guys.
amazing. I was so happy. I was so proud. I'm going to show
Thank you.
all my Polish relatives about that one.
Thank you all. Thank you for this incredible endorsement. All right, let's go to the questions here real quick. Of course, you guys should be checking out Jack's work and looking at the book. All right, let's see here. Brem Zwingle says, I love when people whose family got here in the past 50 years call me a fascist because I think I have more of a claim because my family came here on the Mayflower. Yeah, and that really is, critical. Again, there are, of course, terrible people whose families have been here for a long time, but ultimately the nation is its people, right? And you have to recognize that perhaps if you get the gracious invitation to become part of America, you can weave yourself into the fabric of it. But the idea that someone who got here 5 minutes ago and is going to lecture you on whether or not, capitalism is a great evil and has to be overthrown, I think it's reasonable to do what Jack did and say, well, maybe that guy's not quite as American as the guy who's been here since the Mayflower.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've always felt very blessed to be in the United States. America's the greatest country on planet Earth. I teach my kids to be patriotic as much as possible, and that's something where you go out and you just look at it like at a baseball game or a football game or something where we still do the national anthem, and that's one of the last actual civic rituals that we still have. And you look and just in my lifetime, in our lifetime, you've seen more and more people don't even stand up anymore, and they're not teaching their kids to stand up. And I would not be a pundit or whatever I'm supposed to be, worth my salt if I didn't point out that it clearly seems to have an ethnic, an ethnic character to that in terms of who stands up for it and who doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, people will always say, well, I know an immigrant who is the most American person I know, knows more about America. Everyone else is proud to be American. And by the way, God bless those people, right? I'm
Yeah,
more than
of
happy.
course.
Right. But let's not pretend that is always the reflection, that's a one-to-one, that is, that exceptional individual therefore reflects all of illegal and legal immigration. These are not necessarily the same thing, even though, you may know a fantastic immigrant who truly does love the United States, and God bless him for it.
Well, and that's the problem, right? Because you do have those situations, but of course that is completely overshadowed by the vast bulk of the problem. That's also
Right.
what they call it, the Naxalt fallacy.
Yeah, you need to be able to judge groups, at scale. You can't just look at one individual and say they represent everything about this group I want to project on.
Great 115er test, by the way.
Robert Weinsfield says, 1950s, you are what you are. 1990s, you can be whatever you want to be. 2020s, you are whatever you want to be. Or more importantly, I think in this case, Robert, you can be what they want you to be, right? Like this is ultimately, you can be what you want to be, where you want to be, or the left can shape you into the type of soldier that they want you to be once you get here. I think that's a big part of what a number of immigration fifth columns have become, unfortunately, in major American cities.
Yeah, we've gone from choose your own adventure to your adventure is chosen for you.
Right. And your adventure is you need to destroy the United States and everything that's been built here.
Yeah.
Robert Weinsfield also says, just hear me out, Sam Hyde for Supreme Court justice. Well, I mean, Trump might get a shot at one more. So,
we'll see.
Let's hope that Clarence stays with us. But, Sam Hyde, he could slide into that seat. Mel Gibson, after 4 beers, says, I care about the Epstein list, but the truth is I ultimately care more about deportations. Also, have you heard of Andrew Wilson, and would you ever have him on? You're my 2 favorite channels, and I think that'd be great. I have not heard of Andrew Wilson. If you want to send something my way, you want to email or shoot me something on Twitter, perhaps I can take a look. But Jack, we didn't get to talk about this, and obviously we're not going to have a ton of time to dive into it. But the Epstein list obviously has become a flashpoint right now. A lot of people are saying this could be a serious blow to the MAGA coalition. I think ultimately a lot of people were heartened to see Trump talking about releasing grand jury testimony, depositions, these kind of things. But ultimately, do you think this is an issue that can be resolved between the base and the administration, or is this an internet thing that's just being overblown?
Well, I think we're seeing that. By the way, I think I've seen Andrew Wilson on whatever, just to answer that question. So I've seen him there. That's all I've seen of his stuff. I mean, it seems pretty good. I mean, I do more newsy type stuff, so I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with him.
Come on for that, but I wouldn't be opposed to it. Well, as far as Epstein goes, I think it's become a flashpoint in the sense that, and by the way, like people say it's an online thing, and I'm like, Shane Gillis is joking about it on ESPN, and the entire crowd is
kind of
laughing.
important. Yeah.
So I mean, clearly this is broken. Whatever it was prior to then, has now grown into a much bigger thing. And so there's the Streisand effect. But what's amazing though is you saw President Trump come out last night and say that he does want to push for disclosure on this. And, apparently one of the things driving this was this Wall Street Journal story that had I guess it was cooking in the background and not everybody realized it. And that's was leading towards some of the tension, but it just really just fell apart when they put it out. I don't think anyone buys it. It was just so silly. And it had the, opposite, I think, intended effect of trying to make Trump look like he was connected to Epstein. I think it just showed people how tenuous and ridiculous this connection was, other than just, someone that he knew fleetingly from being in the Palm Beach scene, which has already been litigated and has been in the public for years. And when it comes down to it, I mean, Trump has been investigated again and again and again when it comes to this stuff. But I do think on the Epstein files in general, the reason why it matters to people is because it's become an inflection point of, sort of this idea of shadowy elites who are operating for their own benefit, some possibly for these deviant ideals and deviant perversions rather than for the benefit of the people. And that really strikes to the heart of what the MAGA movement has always been about. And Donald Trump as a figure, he's been the man who came down from behind that curtain, came down the golden escalator and said, I'm going to tell you the truth about what goes on in those shadowy rooms because I was in there.
Yeah, that's really important. Of course, like so many, I also put deportations and border security as my number one issue. I want that to be what the administration does. And I understand why ultimately they don't want to make their entire presidency about the Epstein files and all these things. But there is a core value, as you just said, about ultimately understanding that the MAGA base wanted Donald Trump to unspool the Washington elite. It wasn't just about one issue or one ideological thing. Ultimately, they knew the swamp was corrupt. They wanted him to clean it out. And that's for them what I think Epstein represents. Like you said, I don't think Trump was involved in this. Ultimately, I don't think that is a valid line. I don't think that's why he is dodging this. If it was, then it surely would have come out through all the different investigations of Trump. The Democrats literally tried to put him in jail. They just made up crimes. So like if they had him on this, they would have come for it. So I think it really is ultimately about that unmasking of the elite class and making sure they can't just get away with everything. That's what I think people are ultimately drawn to with the Epstein stuff, not necessarily, one specific ideological piece or another.
Yeah, I think MAGA really comes down to sort of like it's people who like Trump plus people who hate the government, right? And those are like the two broad groups. And so, that obviously with a lot of overlap and a lot of various issues, but that's kind of what it comes down to. And this has become a huge flashpoint for that.
Fiad Saninja says, do you think there's an ethnic American? How would you define it? Have you gone through ethnogenesis yet? Is it still happening? Do we have more claim to America than a good/based immigrant? So, I went deep into this with Doug Wilson, actually. So if people are interested in looking at longer dives, we're obviously not going to be able to spend 2 hours on it like we did there. So if you want a deeper look into that, but to Cliff Notes this one really quickly, basically Doug's assertion was that there was an ethnogenesis in the United States and that the post-1965 immigration waves more or less broke any part of that coming together. I think it's a little more complicated. I think you have to look at Civil War and a number of other things that set back the American ethnos as a solid identity. Here's the one thing I know now. We have to have one. We have to be a unified nation. And that's why I support an immigration moratorium and a focus on an Anglo-Protestant identity. Again, not that everyone will convert to Protestantism or will magically turn Anglo, but this idea that this, as Samuel Huntington put it, is kind of the guiding star for assimilation and the core of our culture. If we recognize that, we have a better chance at forging an ethnos, creating an ethnos, having that ethnogenesis, than if we just continue along our current path.
Yeah, no, I mean, my response is that, I think that's basically what we've been talking about,
right,
on the podcast writ large, but also that, there's a lot of work out there that we're like not supposed to read. Albion Seed is a great example of this as well, talking about the different founding stocks of America as it came to be, and then you go past that. Plus, there's this huge idea that like, Ellis Island, and they totally changed the way. But a lot of Ellis Islanders went home too, by the way. Not all of us. And it wasn't this massive transformation of the entire American ethnicity the way that we're seeing now. It just wasn't. The numbers just don't match.
We've got Posmo complaining about the mics a few times. Let's see here. We've got Philosophical Thirster. He says, Not really immigrants, but my hometown took in thousands of Katrina refugees and it destroyed it. Safest town in the state, one now to one of the least safe. And you know, this is its own problem, right? Just inside the country. I live in Florida, and fortunately, we are marred by waves of different northerner, migration down here. They run away from COVID, they run away from high taxes, and they come down and they want to do exactly what immigrants do. They want to immediately start voting for the policies that turn New York into New York or California to California. So yeah, this is even a smaller problem. Just when you're in the same nation with the same people speaking the same language, of course it's going to be even more of a problem when you start bringing people from vastly different nations and cultures.
Yeah, and that's a great example of why we should take things like mass migration very, very seriously. Because
Right.
even within one country, you can have these massive differences. Also, America, of course, even prior to 1965, was not entirely homogenous. That's always been part of the American character, and so these are things that actually should be taken very seriously. And we shouldn't be told, "Oh, you shut up! You're not allowed to talk about that because that's a no-no issue." It's like, no, we're not doing that anymore because we can all see the after effects of it and we can see how bad they've been.
Yeah, the hour is late. We don't have time to sit around and
No.
pretend like this isn't an issue. Mark says, I have the Sam Hyde approach. We all know what an American is and what it isn't, just a matter of who wins out. Yeah, again, I think that sometimes delving into the nuance really just creates an issue when you can just cut through and say, yeah, we actually already know what this is. Pound and Yokel says the left references the founders to defend the democracy constantly while ignoring founding documents such as Federalist II or the 1780 Immigration Act that coldly condemn their pluralistic fantasy. And yeah, that it is a very selective history. It all kind of started around 1965, maybe 1945. We never look back at these older documents. We never look back at John Jay explaining how he wants us to be one people, speaking one language, having one common history. These are what our founders said, but we just kind of jump to the end and drop this progressive understanding of what America should be rather than looking at what the people who founded it actually said explicitly.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much done on this, and I really do think that there's definitely a book out there to be written. I think on all of this, it's sort of like what is an American according to the founders of America,
Right.
and that really dives into all of this. That just gets rid of so much of this bad pop history. I hate pop history so much, but this really, really bad pop history about the founders.
Just got two more and then we'll get out of here. We've got Posmo says this labor is only cheap to the employer because of course it's subsidized by middle and lower class Americans who get diminished institutions. He also follows up and says the labor was cheap, but Jack lost his family home and community to actually so it's actually enormously expensive. The employer pocketed the difference as profit. And this is really important, right? We see a lot of these corporations pushing the open borders because they can privatize the profits, but they can make public the costs. And that's really what he's talking about here. Yeah, you get to rake in the money because you had cheap labor. And maybe I pay a little less for a flat screen TV, but now my kids can't go to school and hear the language they grew up with spoken. They can't go down to the corner store because it's too dangerous anymore. We can't stay in the neighborhood. We have to move away from our family home. These are the real costs. You can't put them on a spreadsheet. I don't immediately see them in the GDP or the economic activity, but that's the real externalized costs, even though they got to privatize all the profit.
I'll give you a great example. So where we lived, what we had, I mean, and by the way, my town wasn't like some like fancy whatever, but it was good. It was just good. And where we lived, right on the corner, we had corner store, laundromat, and a drugstore. My dad used to work at that drugstore. They had a malt shop in the 50s, 60s. They used to do that. My dad used to be the kid who would run up and down, hey, your prescription's ready, that kind of thing. I remember even when I was a kid, because I had this tiny little taste of it. And this is the Northeast outside Philly. And they had, the comic book spindle where I could, get my other get a new Batman comic or a new Superman comic. By the way, I saw the new movie. It super sucked. Just not woke, just bad, just really bad. And that store now is like an African food mart. And if you go to the convenience store, it's run by Indian immigrants, and it has like casino games that are lining throughout it now where you can gamble inside, where I used to just, bring a nickel and get some bubble gum or something.
Yeah, you really lose that feeling of community because everything only exists again to extract money.
Right.
There's no community built into it. It's how many gambling games can I pack into the
Hmm.
square footage? Who cares about the community who used to gather here, make this part of their identity? What if I can get a few more dollars out of them? And that is again a cost you can't put on the spreadsheet, but one you will notice, and your children will notice if you're paying attention. All right, guys, we're going to wrap this up. I want to thank everybody for watching. Jack, thank you so much for coming on. Everybody, again, should be checking out his stuff and picking up his book. If it's your first time on this channel, you need to subscribe on YouTube, click the bell, notifications, all that stuff so you know when we go live. And if you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.